On February 2nd, 1922, in the quiet heart of Los Angeles, a man was found dead on the floor of his living room. But what happened next was not justice. It was control. Before police even arrived, men in suits were already inside the house. Not investigators, not officers, studio executives. They moved quickly, deliberately, as if they had rehearsed this moment long before it ever happened. Letters were removed. Photographs disappeared. Witnesses were silenced with money instead of questions. Within hours, the scene of a murder had been rewritten. And just like that, the truth began to vanish. For a century, Hollywood told a different story. A softer story. A controlled story. The official version called it unresolved. But behind that word was something far darker. 3 women stood at the center of suspicion. One of them owned a revolver that matched the murder weapon. Another confessed on her deathbed. And the third went to her grave swearing she knew exactly who pulled the trigger. But none of them were ever fully held accountable. Because in Hollywood, truth is not always something that survives. The man at the center of it all was later remembered as one of early cinema's most respected directors. A refined figure, a gentleman of culture, a man who helped shape the language of film itself. But that was not the life he was born into. He was born William Cunningham Dean Tanner in Ireland in 1872, into a family that expected order, tradition, and obedience. His father was a military man. His uncle moved in political circles. His future was supposed to be written in advance. But William never followed scripts. As a young man, he was sent to Kansas, to a ranch that soon failed. From there, his life unraveled into motion. He drifted across America, taking any work he could find, disappearing into traveling theater companies, changing names, reshaping identity like it was fabric he could tear and sew again. By the time he reached New York, he was already someone else. A new marriage, a new life, a new identity. And then, one day in 1908, he simply walked out of his business and never came back. He vanished. The man who left had a wife, a child, and a stable future. The man who returned did not exist. Years later, he resurfaced in Hollywood, and this time, he rose quickly. By 1913, he was directing films, silent films, hundreds of them, stories of innocence, betrayal, morality, and consequence. He became a trusted name in the industry, working with rising stars and shaping early cinematic storytelling. To the outside world, he was a success story. But behind the camera, he was still a man who had already once erased himself from existence. And perhaps that is why what happened next became so difficult to understand. In 1918, at the age of 46, he enlisted in the war effort. He returned as a decorated officer, a man of discipline, a man who had seen violence not as fiction, but as reality. By 1921, he was back in Hollywood again, more respected than ever. But something had changed. He was no longer just a director. He was a man carrying secrets. On the evening of February 1st, 1922, he spent his last night alive in a quiet bungalow in Los Angeles, a small apartment complex surrounded by gardens. Nothing about it suggested tragedy. That evening, one of Hollywood's biggest stars, Mabel Normand, arrived at his home. They laughed, they drank, they talked about philosophy, psychology, and life. Music played softly. The atmosphere was casual, almost intimate. Then she left. The door remained open behind her. At 7:50 p.m., a single gunshot tore through the silence. No alarm was raised. No police were called. And for the next 12 hours, the truth was left alone with the body. When the housekeeper arrived the next morning, William was lying on the floor, dead. At first glance, it looked peaceful, almost staged. Then someone turned the body, and everything changed. A bullet wound in his back, close-range discharge, powder burns on his jacket. This was not natural death. This was execution. But by then, the scene had already been compromised. Studio men arrived first. They did not wait for investigators. They did not wait for protocol. They began removing objects immediately. Letters, documents, personal belongings. Anything that could create scandal disappeared into private hands. Because in 1922 Hollywood, reputation mattered more than truth, and silence could be purchased. But even in chaos, evidence is a way of surviving. Inside the bungalow, investigators later found love letters hidden in boots, photographs scattered across furniture, a locket around his neck containing the image of Mabel Normand, and another presence, equally impossible to ignore, a young actress named Mary Miles Minter. Her letters revealed obsession, emotional intensity, a belief that she and William were destined to be together. But William did not share that belief, and standing between them was her mother, Charlotte Shelby, a woman with influence, control, and a reputation for volatility. She owned a revolver that matched the type used in the murder. She had threatened William before. She had confronted him in anger, and she had the motive to protect her daughter's career at any cost. In the shadows of early Hollywood, control was everything, and William represented a threat to that control. Scandal could destroy the entire industry. Within months, studios formed powerful internal organizations designed to control image, narrative, and public perception. What could not be solved legally would be managed socially. What could not be proven would be buried. And in that shift, the modern Hollywood machine was born. But the murder of William Desmond Taylor never truly disappeared. Decades later, new investigators revisited the case. One director became convinced the truth had been obvious all along. One researcher uncovered forgotten documents. One theory pointed toward blackmail gone wrong, another toward organized retaliation, and one story emerged that still haunts the case to this day. A woman, near death, reportedly confessed that she had killed him, then died moments later. No trial, no verification, only words and silence. More than 100 years have passed since that night in 1922. The bungalow is gone. The witnesses are gone. The studios that cover the evidence have changed beyond recognition. But the question remains exactly where it began. Who killed William Desmond Taylor? Or perhaps the more unsettling question is not who, but how many people knew the truth and chose to hide it. Because in Hollywood's earliest days, before rules and regulations, before censorship codes and public accountability, power did not just create films. It created reality itself. And sometimes it rewrote death. And so the case remains. Not solved, not closed, but preserved, like a film that was never meant to end. A story still playing in the dark, waiting for someone to finally turn the light on. Because even after a century of investigation, the strange thing about the William Desmond Taylor case is not just that it remains unsolved. It's that every answer ever proposed seems to create two new questions in its place. In the years following the murder, investigators returned again and again to the same physical space, hoping that time might reveal what speed and panic had concealed. But time did the opposite. It erased clarity, and in its place, it left fragments. Fragments of testimony, fragments of evidence, fragments of truth that never fully aligned. One detective noted something unusual about the crime scene that was never properly explained in early reports. The positioning of the body. William Desmond Taylor was not simply lying where he fell. There were subtle indications that his body had been adjusted, not dramatically, not theatrically, but enough to suggest that someone had taken time inside that room after the shooting. Someone who did not immediately flee. Someone who stayed. That detail alone complicates the entire timeline, because if the killer left immediately after firing the shot, then who had time to return? Or more disturbingly, who never left at all? This question led later investigators into a darker possibility, that the murder may not have been a spontaneous act, but a staged event within a controlled environment, a killing followed by a quiet rearrangement of reality. In early Hollywood, where studio influence reached into police departments, newspapers, and courtrooms, the idea was not impossible. It was plausible, and that is what made it dangerous. Because plausibility, in this case, meant there were no limits to who could be involved. Studio executives had motive, actors had motive, private individuals had motive. Even people within William's closest circle had overlapping emotional and financial stakes tied to his silence. But one pattern kept reappearing across all versions of the case. Control. William Desmond Taylor was not just a director. He was a gatekeeper of reputation. He knew secrets. He protected careers. He intervened in personal scandals that, if exposed, could destroy entire film studios. In a world where image was currency, William held a dangerous position. He was trusted, and trust in Hollywood of the 1920s was not always a virtue. It was leverage. That is why so many later theories return to a single idea, that his death was not random, but necessary, because the moment he died, a vacuum was created, and that vacuum was immediately filled by silence. Studio memos from the era show unusual coordination in the days following the murder. Public statements were carefully worded. Press releases avoided emotional language. And most importantly, certain names were never mentioned in official communication, even when witnesses placed them near the center of events. It was not denial, it was omission. And omission, in investigative terms, is often more revealing than confession. As the investigation weakened, public attention shifted elsewhere. Hollywood was growing rapidly. New stars were emerging. New scandals were forming. And the industry had no interest in slowing down for a single unresolved death. But privately, something had changed forever. The industry had seen its vulnerability exposed, and it responded not with transparency, but with structure. Within months of Taylor's death, internal systems of control became stronger, more organized, and more deliberate. Public relations teams were formalized. Studio influence expanded into journalism, and reputational damage became something to be managed rather than confronted. The message was clear. Another Taylor situation would not be allowed to happen again, not because justice demanded it, but because exposure was expensive. Meanwhile, the people closest to the case began to fracture under pressure. Mabel Normand, once adored by audiences, became increasingly isolated. Her name, once associated with laughter, became linked to suspicion. Even though she was never charged, the shadow never left her. She continued working, but the industry had already made its decision quietly. She was no longer considered safe for audiences. Mary Miles Minter's decline was even more abrupt. At only 19, she was already one of Hollywood's rising stars. But the letters discovered in Taylor's belongings placed her directly into the emotional center of the investigation. Love, rejection, obsession, control, then suspicion. Her career collapsed not through conviction, but through association. Hollywood did not need verdicts. It only needed perception. And perception, once formed, is nearly impossible to erase. Years later, when she was asked about William Desmond Taylor, she refused to speak, not out of secrecy, but out of exhaustion, because in her world, silence had become survival. As decades passed, the case transformed from active investigation into cultural mythology. Writers revisited it. Directors reimagined it. Researchers reconstructed timelines that no longer had witnesses to challenge them. Each generation believed it had discovered something new, but each discovery ultimately led back to the same wall. Missing records, lost evidence, unverifiable testimony, and institutional silence. By the 1960s and 70s, the case had become a symbol, not just of a murder, but of early Hollywood itself, a place where power operated faster than law, and where truth was often shaped after the fact. One investigator described the case not as a mystery waiting to be solved, but as a story that had already been decided in real time and simply never documented honestly. That interpretation changed everything, because it reframed the question entirely. Instead of asking who pulled the trigger, it asked who controlled what the public was allowed to believe afterward. And that answer points not to one person, but to an entire system. A system capable of removing evidence before investigators arrived. A system capable of redirecting suspicion away from powerful individuals. A system capable of turning murder into ambiguity. Even today, the physical traces of the case tell a fragmented story. The bungalow where William died no longer stands in its original form. The surrounding neighborhood has changed beyond recognition. The people are gone, the record scattered, and yet the absence itself feels intentional, as if the case was never meant to be preserved in full, only in pieces, because pieces are easier to manage than truth. And in that fragmentation lies a final unsettling realization. This case may never have been designed to be solved, only contained. But one detail continues to echo through every theory, every book, every investigation. William Desmond Taylor was not a man without enemies. He was a man surrounded by competing interests, hidden relationships, and powerful individuals who all had something to lose if his private life became fully visible. And in a world where reputation meant survival, Visibility was dangerous. In the end, the most haunting aspect of the case is not the murder itself. It is what followed: the coordinated silence, the rapid removal of evidence, the immediate shaping of narrative, and the way an entire industry learned, almost instantly, how to protect itself from consequences. That lesson outlived everyone involved, and it still defines how Hollywood manages crisis today. So when people ask who killed William Desmond Taylor, the answer remains unresolved in legal terms. But historically, the answer may be something more uncomfortable, because sometimes, in systems built on image and influence, truth is not hidden by one person. It is distributed across many hands, across many decisions, across many silences. And that is why, even after 100 years, the case still feels open, not because we lack evidence, but because the evidence was never allowed to fully exist. And somewhere in the fragments of that erased story, a final truth still waits, not to be discovered, but to be acknowledged. And until that moment arrives, the last scene of William Desmond Taylor's life will continue to play, unfinished, unanswered, and impossible to forget. The silence that followed William Desmond Taylor's death was not the silence of peace, it was a silence of control. Because long before the public ever heard his name again, Hollywood had already made its decision, not about who killed him, but about what version of the story would survive. In the days after the investigation collapsed into confusion, something unprecedented happened inside the film industry. Studio executives didn't just try to manage the scandal, they reshaped reality itself. Documents were quietly rewritten. Witness statements were softened. In some cases, they were simply erased. Careers depended on forgetting. Entire careers were built on silence. And in that silence, a new Hollywood was born. A Hollywood that understood something dangerous had just happened. Not only a murder, but exposure. Exposure of power behind the curtain. Exposure of addiction, jealousy, manipulation, and influence so strong it could bend police investigations and public truth. But the deeper question remained unanswered. If so many people had motive, if so many had opportunity, then why was no one ever convicted? The answer may lie not in one killer, but in a system designed to make sure no single truth ever fully surfaced. As the years passed, the case became something else entirely. It stopped being just a murder investigation and turned into a collection of competing truths, each one carefully constructed, each one emotionally convincing, none of them fully proven. Some investigators insisted the answer was Charlotte Shelby, a mother whose control over her daughter had turned into obsession, and whose anger toward Taylor had reached a breaking point no one could ignore. They pointed to the weapon, the threat, the timing, and the desperate efforts to construct an alibi that never fully held under pressure. Others rejected that idea entirely. They believed Shelby was too obvious a suspect, too perfect a villain for a story Hollywood was already eager to simplify. Instead, they pointed toward the darker corners of Los Angeles at the time: drug networks, blackmail schemes, and criminal intermediaries who operated just outside the reach of law enforcement. In this version, Taylor was not killed in a moment of passion, but in a calculated act of retaliation, a warning, a message that went wrong. And then there was a third theory, the one that unsettled historians the most, that William Desmond Taylor wasn't killed because of one secret, but because he had too many. A man who had reinvented himself completely, erased his past, built a second identity in a world where identity itself was fragile. In that fragile space, he became everything Hollywood both admired and feared: powerful, respected, and impossible to fully know. And in Hollywood, what cannot be fully known often becomes a threat. But perhaps the most haunting part of the entire story is not the murder itself. It is what happened afterward. Because Taylor's death did not just end a life, it triggered a transformation. Within weeks, studios realized something had to change. The image of Hollywood as glamorous, untouchable, and morally separate from the real world had been permanently damaged. The Arbuckle scandal had already shaken public trust. Taylor's murder shattered what remained. The industry responded not with transparency, but with structure, control, and silence. What followed was the beginning of an era that would define American cinema for decades. A system built not only to regulate content, but to regulate